I'm in a quiet neighborhood in Toronto. There's family homes, elementary schools, box stores. So what if I told you that one of the addresses around here appears to be connected to smuggling $80 million worth of microelectronics to Russia for its war in Ukraine? I'm trying to track down who's behind that address, and I have a lead. It's a murky tale that spans Canadian suburbia, the Caribbean, China, to Moscow. In modern warfare, microelectronics are the lifeblood sustaining almost all weapons.
The occupiers have a significant advantage in artillery. They have much more missiles and planes than we ever had.
But Russia is short on supplies, so it's turned to covertly tapping into places like Canada and the US for everything from semiconductors to microchips. Countries they're sanctioned from buying from. But two independent sources gave me a cache of raw Russian import data from 2023. Thousands of transactions showing technologies sent to Russia. And the curious thing was, a company called Alberton Enterprises appears in at least 1,400 shipments. And next to it, that business address in Toronto. Government records show the company got a license to operate in Ontario in 2015. But check this out. Alberton is actually a British Virgin Islands company, incorporated 3 years earlier.
My initial reaction was that this looked like a really egregious breach of Canada's Special Economic Measures Act. This is quite interesting, right?
I shared what I found with Jessica Davis, a financial crimes expert, previously with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service.
So the kind of things that we're talking about in this case, the number of transactions, the types of technologies, point to or suggest possible sanctions evasion through a Canadian company.
So is this part of a broader scheme to feed the Kremlin war machine with electronics using this Canadian address? And is anyone doing anything about it?
Here in Washington, American officials are serious about going after companies who are selling electronics to Russia.
Matt Axelrod leads the Disruptive Technology Strike Force, a law enforcement unit assembled a year into Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Foreign nation states are working hard to acquire our most sensitive technologies. We're working even harder to stop them.
So if companies are providing Russia with those electronics, they'd be breaking the law and evading international sanctions.
The Russians are not just throwing up their hands and saying, oh, we give up. They are being creative at ways to evade our rules. Russia has used front companies in order to procure items that it wants but can't get legitimately, and it's using front companies now to procure microelectronics.
Axelrod's work took him to Ukraine, where he saw firsthand how microelectronics from the West end up in Russian weapons.
And to the people who are the kind of casual onlookers who will say, who cares about a bunch of microchips being sent to Russia? It's not weapons, it's not bullets, it's not missiles. How important is something like the strike force?
I think it's critically important because the microchips aren't themselves the missiles or the drones, but they are necessary to make the missiles and drones go. So, they may not be lethal, but they end up in items that are lethal. So for us, making sure we're doing everything in our power to reduce, stop, delay that flow is our number one priority.
The FBI and other U.S. authorities are investigating companies and their connections to Kremlin spy agencies.
I don't think this is just individual entrepreneurs in Russia that are obtaining these parts. This is a government-sponsored, state-sponsored effort to procure items for the Russian war machine.
So far, the strike force has laid charges in at least 16 cases, some against Canadians.
Unfortunately, I think this is, I don't think this type of problem knows sort of geographic boundaries.
As for Canada, it doesn't have anything resembling a task force like this. The RCMP told us it hasn't laid any charges for sanctions violations involving supplying parts to Russia, either. But according to Axelrod, Canadian authorities are working with his team and other international partners. And that company I'm looking into, Alberton, it appears to be finding a way around those efforts. And here's how it could be doing that. Even though it's a British Virgin Islands company, it appears to be using the Toronto address as its business address to purchase parts in countries like China, Taiwan, Malaysia, and then from those countries, the parts shipped to Russian companies. They never pass through Canada.
Why wouldn't a company just from China sell those goods to Russia directly?
In other cases, it might just be to try to avoid or evade the sanctions of other countries. So maybe avoiding scrutiny from US law enforcement or UK law enforcement. Having a Canadian address and a Canadian company can sometimes lend a veneer of legitimacy to companies doing this kind of business.
So who is behind this business? When I checked who Alberton's director is in the British Virgin Islands, the name Kristalla Kirkalari came up. She's an Australian national mentioned in over 700 confidential documents from leaks of offshore financial and legal records. Those leaks have exposed a trail of billions in dark money, leading to the Kremlin and Russian President Vladimir Putin himself. Since we've been working on this story, Alberton appointed a new director.
This is one of the things that raises some eyebrows in terms of this company and their activities, because while it is perfectly legitimate to have an incorporation in the British Virgin Islands, using someone who's been in the offshore league suggests the use of something like we call a company formation agent, so someone whose sole purpose is to be the front person for these kinds of companies, which again is legitimate and is legal, but when you look at the other people who are associated with that person, it makes you wonder who else they're doing business with and why everyone's flocking to this one individual. And this is actually a known indicator of money laundering and sanctions evasion.
The British Virgin Islands government told us they don't comment on individual breach reports of international sanctions. But what about that Canadian address for Alberton that appeared on the Russian import data? I've now learned it's the address of someone named Edward Poboreshkin. I'm trying to get in touch with him.
You have reached the voicemail box of
Edward Poboreshkin.
Hello, this is Ben Makuch from CBC News. We've been emailing.
In those emails, he confirmed he was the agent for service and denied any involvement with Alberton's business. He said his last contact with it was 9 years ago. Adding that his address is part of the public record and he cannot control if anyone decides to use it.
As an agent for service, you should be in, I'd say, at least annual contact to confirm that the company that you're representing continues to be accurate.
Michael Otto is a corporate lawyer in Ontario. His law firm acts as an agent for service for several international clients.
So if your personal or business address showed up on Russian customs data and it was being used by a company that you had become the agent for service for, what would your reaction be?
Yeah, we would immediately notify the principal, the entity that we're acting for agent, and say that we're resigning and effective immediately.
Poboreshkin didn't reply as to whether he has resigned as agent for service.
I think for Canadians, understanding that Canada can and is used for illicit finance and trade purposes is really important. So the people who are subject to, for instance, drone strikes in Ukraine, if any of that technology is being facilitated from Canada, there's a direct line between the Canadian economy and the deaths that are occurring in Ukraine.
How then to explain why a suburban Toronto address seems to be mixed up in a plot to send millions of dollars worth of microelectronics to Russia?
The truth lies somewhere between the Kremlin, its clandestine operations, and a Caribbean island.